of paper in there last week, so you can find it again. Habakkuk chapter 1 and beginning in verse 12. Remember, Habakkuk is one of the minor prophets, so you'll find him in the Old Testament, toward the end of the Old Testament. Beginning in verse 12, we read these words. Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You've made people like fish in the sea, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. He gathers them up in his dragnet. And so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net, and he burns incense to his dragnet. For by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? I will stand my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. I've entitled this message, "A Faith That Dares to Ask Questions." Let me get one more. Here it comes. Dry here this morning. A faith that dares to ask questions. There was a Sunday school teacher who was teaching about the omnipotence of God. He's all powerful. There's nothing that he can't do. And she wanted to make sure that the kids were getting it, so she asked kind of a rhetorical question. Is there anything that God can't do? Everyone sat in stunned silence for a minute or two, and then one boy raised his hand. She was disappointed. They were doing pretty good by not answering the question. But now she's a little disappointed. What is this guy going to say? But nonetheless, she calls on the little boy, and she says, okay, what is it that you think that God can't do? And he said, well, he can't please everybody. Now, I don't know all that was going on in his head when the little kid said that. But there's a lot of truth to that in a sense, isn't there? There's a lot of things that go on in this life that are hard to understand. Life is not always fair. Things happen to us that are not just. And those raise a lot of questions. And I'm sure there's a lot of complaints that come God's way as a result of all that. You can't please everybody all the time. In fact, human beings are pretty difficult to please and pretty good at complaining about it. Now, I want to suggest to you that even though the text calls it a complaint, that what is going on here is more than just complaining. What Habakkuk is doing is something a little bit different. What he's doing is lamenting. And there's a difference, in my view, between complaining and lamenting. And the difference, in my view, is that it's two things. One is that a lament flows from faith. It's because you do believe in God and you can't figure it out in light of who he is that you raise these questions. It's not because you have doubts or a lack of faith. It's very much because you do have faith that you're raising the question in a lament. Now, if you're just complaining, you could be doing that for a lot of different reasons, but it's not based on faith. It's based on the fact that I don't feel very good about my situation right now, and I just feel like I need to complain about it to somebody. The other big difference is focus, because in lament, what you're doing is you're focusing your concern to the Lord. You're bringing it to him. When we're complaining, usually we go to each other. It's real easy to complain. It's always easy to find people who are happy to hear about our complaints. God enjoys and wants us to come to him with our concerns. He wants us to bring all of our needs and all of our questions and all of our concerns and just lay them out on the table. And that's exactly what Habakkuk does. He says, God, it doesn't make sense. I wish you would answer my prayers. I wish you would revive your people. I wish that you would do something about your people who've strayed far from you. I so want to see them living in right relationship with you, but they're not. I don't want to see judgment, but I wish you'd answer me. God, are you going to ever answer me? Are you listening? He has so many questions, and they're not unlike questions that I think all of us have. I think that's why we can relate so easily to Habakkuk. We all struggle with times when our prayers seem unanswered. When we wonder, is God really listening? And when our life doesn't make sense and things seem unjust and unfair. When bad things happen to us. And it's like, God, where are you in all of that? But the response of Habakkuk is, don't keep it inside. Pour out your heart to God. Pour out your heart to God in faith, trusting him, waiting upon him, expecting him to work things out for good, yes. But pour out your heart to God. I think that Habakkuk is not just complaining. He's lamenting. He's pouring out his heart to God. And remember I gave you the example of Tevye a couple of weeks ago, and Fiddler on the Roof, how he's always, oh God, my horse too. I mean, I can understand why you're mad at my wife when she's doing this, but my horse wasn't. So when bad things happen to him, he starts to lament to God. And if you want to learn about lament, Fiddler on the Roof is pretty good for that. But now the reason why we may need to lament, I saw this on Facebook this week. I thought this is perfect. You have a plan for your life, and then God has a plan. You ever feel like this is totally what I'm experiencing? My plan is just a slow uphill, straight line. I get to the finish line, no problems. God, he has twists and turns and drop-offs and seas I have to go across and mountains and rain and all kinds of things. And given all the twists and turns and all the hard places, when life gets confusing, what should we do? These times call for a faith that dares to ask the questions, a faith like Habakkuk's. What kind of faith dares to ask questions? Well, let's take a look at that this morning. I think that the faith that we see in Habakkuk and the faith that we ought to have in our own lives that ask questions is, first of all, a faith that remembers who their God really is. When Habakkuk is confronted by the reality of his situation, when he has just been told by God that the surprising answer to his question is that yes, he is listening and he's going to do something about it, is that God is going to come in judgment and he's going to raise up an ungodly king by the name of Nebuchadnezzar, and he's going to use him and the Babylonians to come against them and to take them into exile and to destroy the holy city and the temple and everything else. He says, I got an answer for you. It's a surprising answer. You're never going to believe this answer. And indeed, it wasn't the answer that Habakkuk wanted to hear. Sometimes God's answers aren't the ones that we like to hear. But he's still good. And he still has plans to accomplish good things, even through the difficulties of life, which we saw last week as we looked at this text. But when Habakkuk is confronted by this situation he just can't understand, God, how could you do this? This doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem just. Where does he go? Where does he turn? Just like the song we were singing. When I don't know what to do, what do? I run to his throne. I run to his word. Sometimes I just lift up my hands, God, and I lament. In all of that, we're turning to him in faith with our questions. Who is God? He says in this text that he's the everlasting God, that he's the Lord, that he's the Holy One, and that he's the rock. These are the words he uses, the names he chooses to focus on as he considers who his God is. that God is, first of all, everlasting. He's the Lord. He's the sovereign. He's the king. He's the one who controls all things. He's the Holy One. And how could he look at this evil? How could he even consider using Babylon to accomplish this purpose? This unholy, ruthless, impetuous people. How is he going to use them? And how is that not going to affect his holiness? But he says, I know you're holy, God. That's who you are. And you are my rock. God, you are completely faithful. If I want to find a safe place, where do I go? I run to you. You are my rock. You are utterly faithful. I know it. I've seen it before. Your word recalls again and again how faithful you've been to your people. Even when they've been unfaithful to you, you haven't forgotten about them. You have not forgotten your covenant. There have been times you've taken them through wilderness and through times of judgment, but you've never forgotten them. You're faithful. Oh, people, when life doesn't make sense, the most important thing we can do is to run to who God is and to remember who he is. Now, that will do two things for us. On the one hand, it will lead us to praise and prayer and taking our situation to the Lord. When we begin to think about who he is and all of his greatness and glory, we can't help but well up in praise. And that will help us through any difficult time that we go through. No doubt about it. It will also put us on our knees because we recognize that he's the one who has the solution to our problem and will cause us to pray. But sometimes it also raises questions. And this is what is interesting about Habakkuk. God is holy, and I know it. So God, how can you do this? How can you use them? Does this make sense? Are you being just? It's a fascinating thing, isn't it? So such a faith is a faith that remembers God's names, that reveal his character and bring hope. And God's attributes, which lay the foundation to faith and to praise and to prayer and sometimes to our questions and to our confusion. Such a faith attempts to interpret your situation in light of who God is. See, whenever life gets puzzling, it's good to try to understand things according to the character and attributes of God. So let's just work this through for a minute. God, you are everlasting. You are eternal. You are everlasting God. This is who you are. Now, what does that teach us? What has he said about the Babylonians and their God? He said their own strength is their God. This ruthless empire that just kind of comes onto the scene in human history, kind of comes out of nowhere and becomes an incredible power and overtakes most of the known world at the time, raises up quickly and they're gone just about as quickly. But in that short period of time, God does use them to accomplish his purpose of bringing the people of Judah into judgment. And that sets up whole stories like Daniel, who's in exile, where? In that same area, in Babylon. And many other stories that we see in the Bible. So compared to the God whose strength, their own strength, which is fleeting, is not going to last for long, we have the eternal God, the everlasting God, the one who always existed and who always will exist, who has no limitation whatsoever, who's always there, who's always strong, who's always powerful. Not a temporary, fading power, but an almighty God. He's also the sovereign. He uses Lord several times here. If someone is Lord, he's the one that you bow your knee to. He's the one who's in control of all things. And indeed, that's who our God is. He calls him several times in this book, Sovereign Lord. You are the sovereign Lord. When the whole world seems to be spinning out of control, know this, it's only an illusion. God ultimately is in control. And yes, he's allowing things to take place down here on this earth, but those are not without purpose, and he will use them for his glory. That's why he can use wicked king like Nebuchadnezzar and turn it out for good. So the things that are spinning around out of control in your life, I guarantee you, he's going to work them out somehow for good. He's promised us that. Romans 8:28. We have a God who's working out all things together for good. He's working out all things, everything. He's the whole of the plan of God is working out things that we can't understand, things that seem out of control and messed up to us, puzzling to us. He says, I got it. I've got it under control. Don't worry. It's in my hands. This may be difficult for a season, but someday you'll get it. Someday you'll understand. He is the sovereign Lord. He says, you have appointed them to execute judgment. You have ordained them to punish. So this isn't some crazy idea that Nebuchadnezzar came up with in his mind. Well, he may have done that. But more than that, it was a part of the plan of God. And there is an unseen reality to things that that happens in the heavenly realms that affects things down here on this earth. Now, there's some mystery here that we don't completely understand, and I don't want to take that away from you. I don't completely understand how it all works either. But the scripture does clearly say that God works in surprising ways, and he takes even the evil intent, plans of the worst intention, and uses them somehow for his good, for his glory and our good. He is the Lord. He is sovereign. And Habakkuk keeps coming back to that. He also says, God, you are my Holy One. You are my Holy One. I like this. He says it like this: your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You can't tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent? Well, the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves. You are the Holy One. Your eyes are too pure. When we talk about holiness, Scripture uses it in a number of different ways. But in large part, it's God's moral uprightness. That he is unlike us in that he's perfect in all of his ways. That he can do nothing that is wrong or sinful or unjust. He is holy. So on the one hand, he's a cut above us. He's completely other than us. He's perfect in all of his ways. But it's also his moral perfection. He can't do anything that is wrong. This, I think, is what raises the question. Is this right, God? Can you actually use this without being tainted by sin in some way? Because they're bad people. How can you use them? It's a good question, isn't it? God is holy. He can't stand to be in the presence of sin. So how can you use someone who's doing something sinful to accomplish your purpose? You can see it's a logical question, right? God is holy. He can't stand to be in the presence of sin. When I think about God's holiness, it reminds me of something that I don't like to be in the presence of. For me, growing up, the thing that I couldn't stand to be in the presence of was onions. Onions, to me, growing up, smell bad. I mean, when they're raw and you cut them, I couldn't, oh man, I hated that smell. But when you cooked them, I didn't like that smell either. And I didn't like the way they looked. I didn't like the way they tasted. I didn't like the texture. There was nothing I liked about an onion. I didn't like green ones. I didn't like white ones. I didn't like whatever color they were. I didn't care. I didn't like onions. Whenever my mom would start to cook and I would smell an onion hit the pan, I would run as far away as I possibly could. I did not want to even be in the presence of onions. There's nothing that I hated more than the smell and the taste of onions. So I always would go to the farthest place where I'd run outside. I would do everything I could to get out of the presence of onions. Well, God's kind of like that with sin. I don't know what he thinks about onions. He created them, so I guess he thinks they're okay. But he doesn't like sin, and he can't stand to be in the presence of it. And this is the question that the Habakkuk is raising. God, if you hate to be in the presence of sin, if you can't even look at it, how could you use a sinful person to accomplish plans against your holy people? The ones who are more righteous than them. Seems like a good question. God's going to give an answer to it, but we're not going to get to it till next week. You have to come back to that. And then there's one last name he uses, and it's my rock. My rock. God's faithfulness. This is the name that describes God's faithfulness. God's unrelenting faithfulness for his people. And this is the reason he can continue to have hope. And he can rejoice in his God, because he knows that while God might judge, and he might take them into exile, and there might be some bad things coming, God will not forget them. And he will care for them. And he will be with his people. He has an unrelenting faithfulness. It's described in the Hebrew word chesed, which we describe as loving kindness or loving mercies. There's a lot of different ways it's expressed in the English. But this beautiful Hebrew word that describes that God is unrelentingly faithful to his people, even when they don't deserve it. And Habakkuk knows this, that God is his rock, that whatever happens, there is a place he can run to, and it's his relationship with his God. That he is the rock brings a hope that God will be merciful, that he won't give up on his people. It brings the hope that even this time of judgment is part of his good plan, as hard as that might be to comprehend. So, such a faith that looks to who God is, to try to answer the big questions. But sometimes that leads only to more questions, and that seems to be what happens in Habakkuk's life. We'll get to that next week. But this faith that asks questions, these laments and complaints are intensified here by his faithful remembering. Sometimes remembering brings even more questions. And so what do? We've laid it all out on the table. We've told God where we're at, what we're going through. We've lamented it, and there's something so therapeutic in doing that. Be a lamenter. There's a good tradition of doing this. Didn't I tell you 40% of the Psalms are laments? Isn't that interesting? This is something we need to do. Just lay it all out on the table. Pour out my heart to God. Here's where I'm at, God. He knows it. But we need to tell him. It's good for us to do so. And when we do, sometimes God answers, but often he makes us wait. He makes us wait in hope. And here's what Habakkuk says. I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this. I'm going to stand my watch. I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait expectantly. Someday I expect God's going to answer, and he's going to. Just wait till we get to chapter 2. He's going to answer. Charles Feinberg said, delay is only in the heart of man. God is working the details according to his own plan. Patience was needed. The purpose of God cannot be hastened, nor can it be delayed. It comes to fulfillment at the appointed time. Sometimes God calls us to wait. And there is much to be learned in the process of waiting. We hate it. You like to wait. You like to go to the doctor's office. I got an appointment at 10:30. 10:45, I'm still sitting there. Oh yeah, we have this form we want you to fill out. 11 o'clock, I'm still sitting there. 11:50. Oh yeah, finally, you can come on in. Don't you just hate to wait? But God seems to enjoy it. He loves to seem to make us wait. And in the process of waiting, he teaches us lessons we can't learn any other way. Lessons of learning how to trust him in the dark. Take steps of obedience even when we don't see where we're going. Tough lessons, but so essential to our walk of faith. And for a time, that's where God leaves Habakkuk, standing, waiting, watching. But eventually he will bring the answer. At least enough of the answer to make him satisfied. And we'll get to that next week. We all have times when life puzzles us. And these times call us to follow Habakkuk's example. To find a faith that dares to ask the questions, to pour out your heart, and then wait in hope. Learning the lessons of faith, learning the lessons of trust that can only be learned in the dark. Well, we're going to leave it there for this week. Next week, God will give us his answer. Let's pray.